Hello everyone. The topic of my presentation today is Sorry, Proud or Silent? Reconstructing Grandparents' Soviet Pasts. Let me start with some quotes from my recent research. My grandma was a party member. I can't tell I judge her. She was a very social person. It was her way to deal with the world. I can't imagine how my grandpa talked so relaxed about his life in the Soviet system. I know how terrible it had to be, and he still seems to be happy. I feel antipathy for this period of time, a certain block. These are the quotes of Lithuanian people raised in the post-Soviet period, and they represent what remains 30 years after the collapse of the Soviet regime. How is their memory formed? Taking into account the family members' experience, communicative memory, confronting, supplementing, or agreeing with the meanings from collective memory level. So the goal of this presentation is to share with you some key findings of my research on how the generation after forms its memory of the recent past they have no experience or very limited experience with. I look at the empirical case of the Lithuanian youth and their Soviet narrative construction. The young generation, new Lithuanian memory generation, grew after the collapse of the USSR, born shortly before, becomes important for several reasons in a post-socialist society. It has to do with the underlying hope for generation as an agency of change on the one hand, and as a transmitter of the existing collective meanings, as well as witness of testimonies of those who have actually lived there. Induction-based analysis not only covers what remains and what meaning is given to the recent past in the personal meaning-making system, more importantly, it gives a chance to look at the process of memory formation itself through interactive narrating and re-narrating on the Soviet past in the families, where two witness generations and one generation after live together, and in the interviews that follow. So the role of the family in memory formation process is also reconsidered. So let me start with the key theoretical assumptions I base my inductive research on. I would emphasize 4 concepts that refer to different levels of memory itself and contribute to the individual narrative. I expect 2 types of memory that interplay in the Soviet narrative of the young generation, namely collective and communicative. They both are constructs, yet of a different nature. I refer to the works of Assmann, Belzer, Earle, wherein I conceptualize different types of memory and their connectedness. Communicative memory is of a vivid character, and family is one of the arenas where this type of memory evolves and develops. Family gives a place and time for narratives to occur, rather than define the content. Collective memory refers to certain collectively defined and structurally implemented meanings of the past embedded in certain media, such as history, politics, measures, monuments, commemoration arts, grand narratives, and other. Generational effect is a phenomenon that allows us to think about memory generations based on assumptions in the works of Mannheim, Schumann and Corning, Schumann and Scott, experiencing critical years, adolescence and early adulthood, in specific historical circumstances, gives to a group of people a common interpretive framework to think about the past. These assumptions have to be tested, but they also find support in psychology research in the works of Schachter, Hirst, and Pelps on the nature of most vivid flashbulb memories and effects of primacy in our brain when memories are formed. And finally, narration and re-narration, following Harald Welzer, approach to memory in the context of German family memories of the Nazi past. The concepts of narration and re-narration represent memory's contextual, socially restricted nature. Individual narrative about the past cannot be excluded from the social context it comes from. And there we also consider the role of the collective meanings that intervene and interplay in the family communication on the recent or in the past, on the past in general. I would like to give some considerable attention to my methodology for the general epistemological questions of how do we access different levels of memory is debatable in the interdisciplinary and ever-growing memory studies field. I partially employ the strategies Harald Welzer applied with my own modifications for the case of Lithuania. I use biographical methods like history, and I also conduct semi-structured interviews with the young generation. From October 2018 and July 2020, until July 2020, I interviewed 15 families of 3 generations, grandparents, parents, and grandchildren of various socio-demographic backgrounds, and also kept in mind the differences of experiences during the Soviet time. In total, 43 stories of 3 family generations were collected. At the family gathering, the member of oldest generation told their life story. The member of parents' generation shared their key memories of the Soviet time. All family members were able to ask questions, start a discussion with the narrator if they wanted to. And the second part, that usually was the next day or a few days after, I met the youngest generation member and asked to re-narrate their grandparents' story the way they remembered it. Semi-structured interviews followed with the questions on the issues of personal understanding what the Soviet past was, Soviet history teaching at school, the university if they went to, films, frequency and depth of family and friends conversations about recent past, general opinion about the resistance movement of the post-war period, and questions of commemoration. Then interpretive analysis followed. As it comes to the results, I couldn't claim there is a single narrative, single unique content that the youth represents in terms of the Soviet past. Yet what defines them as a single memory generation is the way they talk and the aspects they emphasize. The judgment may differ, yet the object of memory tends to be common for them as a group. I compare youngest generation narratives with each other, looking for common aspects, and I also analyze them within the context of their family narrations and their family memories that occurred during the conversations. And in general, 3 key motives occur, namely pride, sorrow, and silence when the grandparents' past is considered. A limited number of cases has some restrictions on generalizations that I could make. In the nature of qualitative interpretive work and in-depth analysis allows me to present the following results. When it comes to the general idea of sorrow, it mostly relates to the images of repressions and deportations. Those experiences are narrated by the grandchildren extensively and dramatically, be it interrogations, repressions, poverty circumstances, or deportations that their family members experienced. On the one hand, negativity, shocking details, in general, help to create a more interesting, vivid nature when they recall their grandparents' history and become narrators themselves. On the other hand, telling the story in line with the grand victimhood narrative that is common in Lithuania is confirming the justice that has been achieved with the restoration of independence, and the grandparents' life was the right one under the repressive circumstances. However, they do not use the image of victim. They tend to look for positive moments in general and emphasize the fight for better life, surviving, and being able to continue their life. Rethinking victims, heroes, or people who were right, and those who were indifferent, appears in the narrative of the young generation when they directly or indirectly compare family experiences with meanings from the structural level. They do not call their grandparents neither victims nor winners of the system, whereas the logic coming from structurally embedded meanings would attribute their stories to this typology. Based on the grandparents' histories, the offspring of successful people tend to be more critical towards the collectively acknowledged images of perpetrator or collaborator or victim. They reflect on this with saying one shouldn't judge anyone without listening to their story. Another prominent motive in the re-narration is silence and its multidimensional nature. Firstly, personal silence. One avoids the topic while another family member puts emphasis on it. Secondly, family silence. One can sense the unspoken objects between the lines, but a decision not to mention them is commonly taken. This can refer to traumatic experiences. On the one hand, there is extensive research from psychology discipline on the transmission of trauma among family generations, and on contradictions with the collective memory meanings, on the other hand. The final silence motive is common when it comes to general grandparents' view on the past. Rather not to mention than to look for a reason why grandparents long for some aspects of the recent past. When it comes to the general evaluation of grandparents' story, silence, I would rather call it a whisper, is mostly prominent when it comes to uncomfortable careers, head of caucus, assistant to the party secretary, or other privileged position. It is not a topic to be completely silent about. Nevertheless, they claim it has not been discussed in the family a lot. Knowing that a grandparent was in a privileged position, they tend to reason and justify it by giving an example on his personal values, ability to help the others, generosity. So the grandchildren indirectly relate privileges to the image of collaboration and belonging to the oppressive system. Contrary to the silence, some aspects are extensively emphasized. The general idea of opposing the Soviet system is prominent. While re-narrating, the youngest generation tends to look for resistance traces in their grandparents' life, called patriotism, passively resisting the system, or most successfully, actively opposing the system, belonging to resistance movement, and so on. Being an offspring of a person who was against is a sign of pride in the context of today's public attention given to the active resistance movement. Young generation seems not to be comfortable with the grandparents' indifference or conformism and tend to emphasize that being indifferent does not mean that family members long for the Soviet past. Even though one agrees that grandparents simply lived an ordinary life, the restricted freedom of speech and thought are emphasized. Grandparents did not actively oppose the system because their actions were restricted. They were scared. Considering positive experiences of their family members, they mention careers, exceptional hobbies, or again stability and simplicity, as well as closer interpersonal relations in the society, more mutual trust. However, at the same time, they underline how low level of individuality occurred, and that was caused by measures towards equality in the society, as well as general observation and spying culture. promoted by the regime. And a specific breaking point towards a higher level of alienation is related to the period of transformation in the 1990s. And these contradictory concerns demonstrate where meanings from communicative and collective level collide. There might be some misleading interpretation made by the youth when they listen to the grandparents' stories and the grandparents talk about the interwar period and compare it to the Soviet period or independent Lithuania, and there might be misleading interpretations that grandchildren make. So what are the conclusions? Actually, I would like to have some normative insights on the results. Family memory is rather a filter than the background for formation of the youth Soviet memory. That is proved, I think. It is a stimulus to rethink our own identity, our personal identity, and also collective identity. If we think of the new generation in terms of their ability to become agents of change, considering memory to politics, we could expect the change in the narratives of suffering and victimhood. Being more critical towards the recent past is a rather positive outcome of collective and communicative memory collision. Young generation being proud about their grandparents' both positive and negative experiences of complicated Soviet past could contribute to modifying the collective meanings of victimhood and suffering, allowing the meanings of striving for better life, becoming successful under restrictive, repressive circumstances, would also contribute to developing of more inclusive collective re-understanding as it comes to the collective identity of the country, experienced major change towards a democratic society. So actually, I think that rethinking family, grandparents' past and their view, encouraging more conversations of this type, and also combining it with the school teaching, I think would be one of the steps to take in order to have a healthier memory climate in the country.